Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, wherever in the world you may be. I am Amy Montalvo, and this is the Good News Global. Now, this broadcast is going to be a little different because it needs to be. Because after the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, I watched from South Africa as my birth country erupted. I watched us begin to confront head-on once again the continued racial injustices in the US on a larger scale than we have in a very long time, to begin to have conversations that are long overdue. For these last several months, I've wanted to do a broadcast on anti-racism, but I just didn't quite know what to say. I didn't think I would get it all right, and I won't get it all right. But I've got a platform, and although it's a tiny one, I know that I need to use what I have to tell you where I stand, who I stand with, and why it's so important for us to be anti-racist. It's important for me to speak out rather than to say nothing, rather than to sit here and be enraged at injustice or despairing about discrimination, but to do nothing to actively change it. And I think that's the main difference between being not racist and actively anti-racist. One is passive and one is active and working to change the system. And if you're watching this and thinking, well, this is not what I signed up for with the good news, well, too bad. This is what you're getting. Because ultimately, good news is truth. Good news is equality and it's equity. And good news is justice for all people. So many of us white people, as we've seen protests over the last few months in the US, have thought, well, I know I'm not racist, so I'm good, right? No, you're not good, and I'm not good, because it's really not enough to say that you're not racist. And as good as your intentions may be in thinking that you always treat others equally or you don't see color, look, we all have biases, and you do see color unless you're colorblind. And so often that influences our thoughts, our actions, and even the subconscious decisions that we make. There are so many biases built into so many of us because of our education, the places we grew up, the people we spent time around, and many times we don't even recognize those biases within ourselves. But I'm going to ask you all, particularly the white people, to step back, to look at yourselves, to look at the history of the US, and then ask yourself, how can I do better? And I'm even going to help you with that at the end of the broadcast, so stay tuned. So for those of you who don't know, I am half Latina. My dad's family a few generations ago came to the US from Mexico, but I look white. And one of the things that I've had to step back and say to myself is that, well, I've never had to deal with racism because I look white. I didn't have to experience the racism that my father once did because I fit in with the race that's given superiority and has asserted supremacy and has been doing that since the foundation of our country. And wow, white supremacy, you white people get real defensive when you say those words together. But offended white people, hear me out. I think the problem is that for so long, we white people have associated the idea of white supremacy with people in white hoods who burn crosses and people who are overtly racist. And you know what? That's not all it is. White supremacy is the idea of elevating and giving privileges to people because of the color of their skin. That's an idea that's embedded in so many of our societies, whether it's through racism or even colorism, and that was the foundation on which the United States was built. But white supremacy, it tries to paint history in another way. The way we're taught history in America is intentional. The US has an ugly, ugly past, and so many policies were designed in America, just as in South Africa, specifically to keep Black people from participating in society in the same way as white people. Those policies and people kept Black people out, and when they accumulated wealth and were successful, white people often came in to destroy that throughout history. And don't question me on that because, again, I've got resources for you later. But education about that ugly history has often been just swept under the rug because we want to believe that the United States has lived up to that piece of founding legislation, that all men are created equal. But even the people who wrote that fundamentally did not believe it. And one more thing I do want to mention, because I've seen and heard so much of it lately, is the idea of white privilege. Now, white privilege doesn't mean your whole life has been easy because you're white. White people can obviously struggle too. but it means that you've probably never had a strike against you simply because of the color of your skin. Now, those of us who are white have received the benefits for so long of education, of land, of housing, of basic human rights. We sit in our privilege because of other people's pain and oppression over centuries. And look, I'm not asking you to feel guilty about that. I'm not asking you to feel shame. Brene Brown actually says that shame corrodes our belief that we can be better or change. What I'm asking you to do is figure out how you can be better, how you can be a part of making things different. What I'm finding over the last few months is that we're far too quick to dismiss people's experiences or stories that are different from our own. We think, well, how could that possibly be true if I've not experienced that thing? Well, because as you know, we're not all the same. We're all experiencing life and society in a very different way, through a very specific lens, especially if you're a person of color. I do not have one Black friend that I've spoken to, not one, that has not experienced racism in one form or another. It's shocking and it's heartbreaking, and the fact that I can be shocked says something about my existence, that I've never even had to consider what that may be like. That's why we need to listen to people of color, to believe them, to step back and hear what they have to say about their experiences. And so I thought a lot about how I might want to present this Good News broadcast in a way that actually doesn't detract from the racial justice conversation and the Black Lives Matter message, in a way that actually amplifies and uplifts that message. And you certainly don't need to just listen to my white voice on this topic. So I've invited in a few friends for a conversation to just talk about their experiences and what we can do to take things forward. And my big question is there any good news when it comes to racial justice? I hope you'll listen to their voices, gain some insight, and get excited about how you can get involved in this fight. Well, I am so grateful to be joined on the Good News broadcast by educator, activist, and advocate, Dr. James Whitfield. Thank you, James, for being here with me on the Good News.
Amy, such a pleasure to be with you and be part of the Good News. I love the work that you're doing. It's been a pleasure to follow you. And so I'm just honored to be part of the conversation with you.
Well, I really appreciate it. And, I feel like there's so much that we could talk about, so many different things, so many different issues we could get into. But something we were discussing before was this idea of, what do we even call this space that we're in right now in the States? I'm over here in South Africa, and I'm watching it all happen in the States. And we know that systemic oppression, that it's not new. We know that racial injustice is not new. We know that police brutality is not new. But there seems to be something about this particular moment, these last few months. So I've even struggled with what do I call this space that we're in when we're talking about it?
Right, and it's been a struggle. We're in this pandemic. We've got this virus that has attacked us all. As crazy as it sounds, it's turned into this beautiful moment for us. There's always a silver lining in anything. And so what this has done is prepare for me, it looks like it's prepared people's hearts and minds to dig into a conversation that, quite frankly, maybe we've just been too afraid to have. As kids growing up, I remember being told, you don't talk about religion, you don't talk about politics, you don't talk about race, you just kind of, those things are too taboo to bring up in discussion. And so it's really no surprise that we have arrived, at this moment kind of timid to speak on certain things. I know I have. And now we have this moment where this pandemic is hit. We're able to see each other in humanity. And so therefore, we're like, okay, we're just gonna jump right in. Forget tapping our toe in the water. We're just gonna jump right into conversation. So I think it's just prepared this moment for us to really move the needle. And I just want to caution us, early on, we had George Floyd, we have Breonna Taylor that we're still seeking justice for right now. And then now all of a sudden, it's like we're kind of slowing that momentum. So it's like we gotta keep our foot to the pedal. We've got to keep talking about these things. We've shown that we have the capacity and the ability to do it. We just have to keep that momentum going. But I think we're primed and ready for this moment.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I think we even talked about this idea, you and I, before, of sort of getting stuck and being nervous to have those conversations, being worried that we're not always going to say the right thing or approach things in the right way. And I know I've felt that personally. But how important do you think it is to push through that and to have these conversations anyway?
Oh my goodness. Yes, we've talked about that, and you're right. We have to push forward and have these conversations, because we've seen, how far we've been able to go without having them. And sometimes there's this book, The Color of Law. It's the forgotten history of how the segregation, how America was segregated, by Richard Rothstein. And one of his quotes in there, he says that we like to think of American history as this continuous march towards greater freedoms, greater equality, greater justice, but sometimes we move backwards dramatically so. And
right.
that could be more true in the moment we're in. We like to think that we've got all this progress going in, but then we see these things coming out on camera, and it's like, oh, there's still a lot of work to be done. Yes, we've made some progress. There's still so much systemic work to be done. And unless we disrupt those systems, we can't get the work done. Just looking back and thinking of my ancestors and what they went through and how much good trouble, using a John Lewis term, how much good trouble that they made. And so I've been having this self-reflective journey of how much good trouble am I making? I think oftentimes when we talk, we think that we have to always paint this picture of everything is good and everything is positive and
right.
Embrace the joy, and that's true. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge the things that are going on. So I feel a great sense of duty to look at, okay, what am I? I've asked myself time and time again, am I doing even a tenth of what my ancestors did to pave the way for me? And so gotten to this point where it's just like, hey, I'm not going to say anything that's degrading to people or disrespectful to people, but I want to speak truth and life into people. And I want to be about advocating for people that, I guess kind of like me, who have been so afraid to speak for fear of, how others might think about that, how they might react. And, it's just so important that we operate with grace in this time. People they've dealt with their own lived experiences, and that's where they're at. And so we can't change that, but we can help meet them there and kind of help them in their journey, wherever that may lead.
Wow. I mean, James, there's so many things while you were talking I just find so fascinating, and I want to dig into so many of those things. So one in particular was talking about your ancestors and what they did, and are you putting in the work? And I remember on Facebook you recently posted, and in the picture you were wearing a t-shirt that says, "I am my ancestors' wildest dreams." And you were also wearing it at a Fort Worth KKK site, which I can't imagine was easy to go to. But why did you go, and what was the message that you wanted to get across to people?
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's kind of like the quote I shared by Richard Rothstein. We think we are so far removed from these things, but we don't realize how relatively short time ago, that's where we were. And I live in a suburb of Fort Worth, just down the road from Fort Worth, Texas, where that picture was taken. And in 1916, that's when the KKK. I mean, in Fort Worth, like, they had one of the largest chapters in the United States of the KKK. It included members of the clergy, it included teachers, it included city officials. Wow. You name it. These folks were part of it. And so you think about who built our systems, and we're seeing now you've got monuments to these people that we're trying to take down, because, like, why are we celebrating people that have been about oppressing others? I've got a great number of family in the Fort Worth area that live just a stone's throw from where that place is. And so where I saw the address, I was like, man, I just want to go down there. I just want to see it. And so as we got there, I was just moved with emotions and thought, man, if my ancestors could see me standing here now, in front of a building that they would have never been caught or like even close to. How proud would they have been of, just the work that they did, because their blood, sweat, and tears are in the foundations of our country, in the foundations of that place of Fort Worth.
Nice.
And so, man, how proud would they have been to see, one, it was just so symbolic that now this building that was once this symbol of power and racial superiority, and to now see it just as a crumbling, old, dilapidated building. It was just so symbolic. And they were talking about, there's this group called DNA Works. They're a fine arts, performing arts school out of the people are from the Northeast, from New York, but now they live in Fort Worth.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're doing a project to try to either tear down the building or convert it into some kind of community space to bring about healing. And they call it repair, repairing relationships. And so, I just thought that was fascinating, and, I had to go by and check it out. And it was interesting to see the number of people that commented on that post, and people that have lived in Fort Worth their whole life and were like, oh my gosh, like this is right down the street from us. Where did we learn about this? And, it's a classic case of we just haven't been told the truth in our country about what our history is. And if you speak on that in our country right now, unfortunately, we've got people that say that is teaching a hate of your country. And we know that's not true. We know that that's just about speaking truth, and it's fact. And it's what we have to deal with facts. We have to deal with the oppression that has happened, the systems that have been built around that oppression, and how that impacts us to this day. It's not a simple, let's just get over it. Well, how can you do that if you don't acknowledge and make meaningful efforts to have the conversations, like we're talking about today?
Absolutely. And I think that's so often the issue, is that I hear so many people saying, well, slavery was a long time ago. Even things like civil rights, we had civil rights, we had a Black president. So like, aren't we good? Like, aren't we fine now? And yeah, I mean, how do you respond to that when somebody comes at you with those things? I mean, I imagine that must be quite offensive actually to start with, but then how do you respond to something like that?
Right. And I've grown in that. My natural inclination is, and I think most of our natural inclination is, when somebody doesn't see it the way we see it, or agree with us, we have a disagreement, we have this propensity that we want to just jump back and defend.
Totally.
Where our position, and just our defenses come up. It's human nature. And so I've had to work on that over the years. I just in full transparency. It's still hard, but I think it goes back to grace and understanding, as hard as that may be, and as maybe as much as it's not necessarily my responsibility to do that. I feel called to do that anyway. And so just listening to people, and because ultimately when people say, hey, that was so long ago, slavery is over, why can't we just move on? Or why are we playing the race card? Or look at you, James. I mean, oh my gosh, can't tell you how many times I've been told, hey, James, look at you. You're a principal at a high school. Look at what this country is giving you. And like, as offensive as that is, I'm just like, you don't realize how racially coded what you just said really is, because the country's given me nothing. I've worked just as hard, if not harder, than you've had to even get a crack at opportunities.
I feel like that language is so casual. It just like that, and people don't think that there's anything wrong with saying that.
Right. And so it's hard, right? And I can't tell you how many times I've heard those same messages, right? And it's like, why do you have to say Black Lives Matter? All lives matter. It's like, but you don't see why, like, you don't understand how sad it is that we have to say Black Lives Matter. We've never had to say white lives matter, because from the founding of our country, they have mattered, right? Specifically white males. And so it's like, people don't really understand. And so while I want to respond that way, we're having just a conversation. While I want to respond that way, I have to take a step back and go, if that's what the verbiage that they're using is, if that's what they're saying, they really don't understand. It's really, we're dealing with, if we look at how we're educated and the system that we go through, well, the system just perpetuates itself. The system withholds information and suppresses information. If you look in any of our history textbooks, I mean, slavery is just like a footnote. And it's like, I mean, slavery is basically the foundation of our country. It was built, through slavery. And, it runs through every aspect of every era of our society, even after emancipation, right? We know that it was just, okay, that's done. Well, we're going to figure out another way to keep you enslaved and hold you down and oppress you. And so, but I don't think that most people, they just say, they think, well, Abraham Lincoln came along and he just wrote that Emancipation Proclamation and we should be good, right? We're good. And not a lot of people, they haven't dug into the facts and what's really happened.
That's why I wanted to have this conversation, because I think that good news can be truth, right? I mean, good news can be justice. What do you think about that idea that what you said, I think, was so interesting, that it doesn't always have to be happy, positive, uplifting, but justice and truth can still be good news, right?
Correct. And like I say, it's been a journey for me, because like how I grew up, I didn't want to deal with any levels of conflict or disagreement. I just wanted to focus on the positive. And it is so imperative, right? There's so much to distract us, so many like negative things going on in our world, so many toxic things going on in our world. And we want to recognize, the great contributions that people are making to our society. Mm. In that, some of those great contributions are dismantling systemic racism. And so to do that is something positive. Mm. But in order to do that, we have to break apart and tear down some very, very ugly parts of our history. And so we're doing something positive, but it's just a kind of a reframe, just changing our mindset around, well, being positive and doing something positive doesn't mean that we have to be sitting here singing and, banging on the drums and dancing. And that's not necessarily it. It's about doing the good work. What is our definition of good? What is our definition of the positive? Everything that we're doing to try to dismantle systemic racism and eradicate racism is it's grounded in truth of what we've done and what we've been through and how it's brought us to where we're at. And we've got to have the conversations and acknowledge that. And it's ugly, but if we're going to bring about anything good, if we're going to bring about the positive and be the positive change that we want to see in the world, we got to deal with some of the ugly things that have happened. Go into it knowing that it's not going to be easy. But we don't grow in comfort. We grow in discomfort. We grow in our willingness to be uncomfortable and have tough conversations. And so I think about, over the course of my life, the moments that I experienced the most growth were some of the most challenging times in my life. And so for us as a country, while it's a great challenge, we need to see this as an opportunity for growth. We still have to be willing to have conversations, because when we eliminate the human element of things, there's only so much. When you're reading a book, that's fine. There's an element of growth that comes with that. But when you're engaged with somebody, the human connection is so important. And when you can hear somebody's story, when you can hear them talk and hear their tone of voice and see their body language, see their facial expression when they're talking about that story of how, whatever happened to them in their past experience and how it affected them, there's so much power in that. And so while I know that it can be sometimes a great burden for some, for me anyway, it's worth it, because that, for me, that personal touch our personal relationships with each other, that's how we really move forward. We can read all the books, but until we're able to do that in practice, right? And take that, what we've read, and apply it. And the only way that we apply it is in our day-to-day interactions with people. And so it's just so important for not only to read it, but if you're going to read it, how, come up with an action plan for yourself. How am I going to apply this in my daily life? Because just to read something is not going to be enough. That's not going to help us move the needle. So have that, action steps. What am I going to do with what I've read? And then be willing to jump in conversations that are uncomfortable. Be willing to say Black, right? When you're having a conversation, it's okay. Don't be weary or leery of saying the wrong thing. And then people on the other side, just give grace and give people the opportunity to, they might get it wrong. They might say it wrong. When you go about trying to fix that, you give them grace. And if we do that, if we can extend each other grace and have an open mind and heart and meet each other with compassion, there is no limit to the work we can do, and we can do it in a shorter time if we operate like that. So that's what I would give to folks, and I'm so excited to see, how we're going to take this moment and really push forward as a country and really as a world, globally.
I am so grateful to be joined by my friend, educator, and advocate, Devin Goodman, who's coming at us from Fort Worth, Texas. Devin, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk education. As always, it's a passion of mine. I'm very pumped to see where this conversation goes for us.
Yes, we're grateful that you're willing to be part of the conversation. And I want to just dive right in from the beginning and talk specifically about a lot of the work that you're doing in education with a good man's education conversation. So if you can tell everyone what that's all about and how you're using that platform.
Of course. So a Good Men's Education conversation came about very organically in the sense that I was already engaged in my community and really saying, how can we advocate for a better public education system that is providing an equitable and supportive education for each and every student to reach the highest level of success possible, not just in their academics currently while they're in school, but well beyond after they graduate and move into the real world. And through a Good Man's Education conversation developing, I've had the opportunity to really engage the community in learning more about the public education system, and also learning about just the systems of oppression that are at play in the public education system and outside that truly just systematically and ancestrally are oppressing and holding back certain communities, certain people. And you see that play out in the classroom largely with certain students, Black students, brown students, disabled students. There are so many students, LGBTQ+, that are in need of different resources, a different system, teachers really seeing who they are. It's been a wonderful way to engage all community stakeholders, parents and teachers. And then as I, over the summer, have started working on a podcast, developing that conversation and really breaking down certain entities of public education, because it's a huge system. And it's a system, as I've said, that I firmly believe is one of the greatest tools upholding systems of oppression, racist ideology, and inherent bias and beliefs and stereotypes that we place upon students at a young age before they're even people. They're still developing, and then that just follows them throughout the rest of their educational career. And unfortunately, that whole person never gets to be all that they could be. And so I'm really excited to talk to you and get a chance to kind of break things down for people, but also really just show that the system was built to be overwhelming. It was built to accommodate and work for white males. And after that, it becomes a bit of a struggle. And you see that in so many different ways, from dress codes for young girls to behavioral concerns that are really just cultural differences, and teachers are just not aware of that cultural respect, regard, or interaction, to curriculum and what that really looks like. And you, especially when you start getting to the high school, middle school level, where what we're teaching, as a lot of people probably seen across the internet right now, where they're like, why didn't I learn this? What is this information that I'm just seeing here? What do you mean this occurred? Well, students might have that knowledge, but a great example I'll bring is in the 7th grade, I brought to my journalism teacher the Tulsa massacre. And was like, look what happened. And she was like, that didn't really happen. And I was like, but we talked about it in my church. And see, like, I have this information here. And she dismissed it and kept it moving. Wow. And then you have the next year with my history teacher, where we're learning about Nat Turner. And she's like, I just have to tell you guys, on a personal opinion, Nat Turner was wrong for his rebellion. He killed children. And I was like, well, so did slavery. Also, my parents are going to hear about this. And that is, for me, a privilege that I've had in education, and why I'm able, I think, now to look back and be like, here's where I can help people, is because I grew up with people who are wonderful educators.
Another thing that stood out to me when you were just speaking was this idea of breaking the system that exists. What is that system, and what are we trying to break down?
So the way I look at it is, it's the system of rules, expectations, and curriculum. And it's all been put into one place, schools, where it is working against children who are just there, fully trusting the entity, parents who are fully trusting that this entity has their child's best interest at heart. And so when I say rules, I mean things like young Black girls and the discipline they face, and the fact that a large amount of the discipline they face, one of the smaller representative numbers in districts, usually the much larger representative in discipline numbers, and how it's a slow way to erode their ability to actually participate in the classroom, to feel like they belong in the classroom, because they're sassy, because they backtalk, because they question. That is a thing that so many teachers still, especially generationally, are like, why are you questioning me? But that's because teachers have been taught in the system that they are the authority and they are the power, and it's not a relationship. And again, that's that system belief, systematic belief. And then on the other hand, with the curriculum, that's where you see it's a very strong word, but just indoctrination, and I probably didn't even say it right, of actually saying, here's what we're going to teach you because here's what we want you to know, and leaving out all of these other things. That's another part of the system, is not actually engaging and teaching and having kids learn for the sake of learning, but kids learning that you sit in your chair and you let that authority figure tell you, here's what you're going to do, and you function throughout the day, and then you go home, and that's when you actually get to take a breath, maybe, depending on your background. Because if you are Black in America, that could be vastly different. Maybe you're not going home to a space where you can breathe. Again, going back to like Indigenous population, what are you going back to as a student? A disabled student? Is your day just getting a little rougher and trying to, okay, now that school's over, what's it going to be like getting on the bus and trying to get home for the rest of the day? The system never thought of or is even still currently thinking of those students. And that's why it's falling so heavily on teachers, but it has to be a full community effort. And again, when I say breaking of the system, well, you have to have that knowledge in order for you to say, this is no longer going to be something that we uphold or allow. I think right now, a lot of people are very frustrated because we're still in that respectability phase of like, do we actually talk about the fact that, like, I don't know, is like, how will people feel and how, well, guess what? The whole point of the school is supposed to be that students get the best education possible. If you're not doing that, then start asking the tough questions and start having the real conversations. Because if you're not doing it, then you failed, period.
It's just, I think, fascinating for me to hear more about that from you, from somebody who's on the inside of that system, and working to break that system and all of the levels that has to happen at. You even talked about uncomfortable conversations and, how you have to have those going forward. And I think sometimes people get nervous about that. Like you said, is that going to be, maybe we just shouldn't touch it because it might feel a little uncomfortable or a little weird. And I read something that just said, don't let anybody gaslight you into believing that fighting for justice is divisive or uncomfortable, so we shouldn't do it, right? That,
Right.
we have to keep pushing, right? Even if it is uncomfortable, even if somebody says, but that's divisive, that's not what it's about. It's about highlighting the inequality and the inequity.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think so often that is the problem, is that the teacher who's finally saying, or the parent who's saying, or the administrator who's saying, this is an issue, people look at them and they're like, why? No one else has said anything. Or you get tears, which is a huge conversation of like, okay, and that's again, on the other side of the table, if you're the person bringing it up to everyone's attention, you got to actually learn how to push through tears and be like, we're still going to have this conversation. Like, there's a advocate educator that I love, Amanda Seals. And she always says, if I'm making you uncomfortable, good. What needs to change? What is happening in that uncomfortableness that is wrongness and that needs to have growth and needs to move forward so that you understand, here's what I did wrong, here's what I'm now going to do better. And I think that's very important in those conversations. And I love that quote. The person bringing it to attention is not the divisive person. The system has created it so that they seem divisive. But guess what? Those are the people who make the change and make it better for the kids. Because again, at the end of the day, the goal is for every kid to have an equitable and the best education possible. And I think when you ask people that, that's where people start looking at, well, have I done that? And again, self-accountability too. If you're doing self-reflection, then you're not feeling attacked when someone brings it up. Maybe you're feeling confirmed and saying, you're right, I thought this, but I wasn't sure. Thank you for having this conversation and discussion with me. I'm going to go back and do the work. I appreciate that. And that comes into that whole teachers, admin, we're not the end all to be all in authority. There has to be growth for us.
Speaking about bringing the community in and getting the community to invest, you recently did a campaign in Dallas-Fort Worth, an offshoot, I think, of the National Share the Mic campaign.
Yeah.
So maybe you can tell me a little bit about that and how that all came about.
So the national campaign of Share the Mic was a wonderful movement. I learned so much from so many different entities, and I wanted to bring it to the DFW, and I reached out to Holland Collective. And in doing this campaign, not only were Black women amplified, but just a diverse, people got to see that like any culture in any community, there's so much more there than what the narrative has allowed there to be. And so many of us brought different backgrounds, and the way that we presented our information and our passions and our knowledge, and also just across all different generations. And we learned from all of those people and saw that they're doing work in their own ways. And again, that individuality of each Black woman and their knowledge being highlighted. And I think it was, again, a wonderful way for me to hold myself accountable for what I teach my students to be in the classroom, or model for them to be in the classroom, actually in the community, holding myself accountable to that. And even with what I talk about, making sure I'm mindful of, like, am I actually doing these teaching practices? Am I actually having these conversations? Am I really doing these things? A great way for me personally to just have that accountability and do the work and make sure that I'm not just resting in conversation, because that is the point of the conversations. Move into action, give you the support and the knowledge, so then you move into action.
Do you then feel through the campaign, with these Black voices being elevated and amplified, things that should be happening all the time anyway, but we know that they're not, do you feel that that is, or that can be called good news?
I think that if there has been anything that I have personally learned, is that in all the ancestral history of being Black in America that I have learned, is that there is good news to be found in the struggle, in the community, in the culture, in the laughter and the joy. And the goal of what the work that is being done is that it is not all of that through the pain, through the survival, but just in the existing of. That is where we go from the here is the good news to we are living in the good news. And I think that while it is, again, one of those things where people are like, oh, but I want to be there, it's also one of those things of, and look where we've come from. While, yes, we could be 1,000 paces ahead, here's where we are, and we are having this conversation, and those women have those conversations, and we know that we'll be leading further and moving. And like I said, for my students, generationally, they saw it, I've invested in them, and they're turning around and doing the work. So again, fully, I believe that you have to look at it and say, where's the goodness in this, and where will this goodness take us?
Thank you so much to James and Devin for engaging in those conversations with me. They both had so many important things to say, so much knowledge, and so I will be providing those full interviews later if you'd like to hear more from them. Musician, writer, and activist Andre Henry has studied protest and civil resistance around the world. He says no regime could withstand the sustained strategic resistance of just 3.5% of the population. That's just 9 to 10 million Americans who care enough about anti-racist progress to do something about it. He goes on to say, if the status quo is sustained by our mass consent, it can be changed by our mass dissent, our mass defiance, our participation in a new normal. I know that I personally want to be part of helping to create that new normal. And I recognize that there's so much that I don't know, that there's probably so much that I'll get wrong, and so much that I still have to learn. But I hope that you'll learn with me. I know that learning about racism instead of experiencing it is a privilege. I'm putting a list of resources at the end of this broadcast, content to watch, to read, to listen to. Pick your medium and get after it. If you're one of those people that's saying, well, I really do care, but I don't know what to do, I don't know where to start, you can start by making a commitment to learning. And then by doing, marching, giving, calling your policymakers, letting people know that we will not rest until the work is done. We cannot let this momentum taper. We have to decide that there's something that must change, and we have to be engaged in this conversation, even if we're just pulling up. I know that I'm committed to fighting injustice, to not sit quietly in the back and hope that things will change, and I hope that you'll join me. Let's be deliberate, let's be relentless, let's pursue justice. Because good news is truth. Good news is equality, it's equity, and good news is justice for all people. So thank you to everyone out there who is continuing to spread the good, who is pursuing good and pursuing justice in this world. And remember, that could be you too. You'll see that list of resources right after this. Dive in, let me know what you're doing. I'm right there with you. In good we trust.